Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot had their year-end press conference, and I think we have a timeline on when maybe we'll see a new defensive coordinator here in Atlanta. We'll talk a little bit more about whether there is pressure on this regime to win and make the playoffs in 2023, and we'll also talk about Falcons CEO Rich McKay and what his role exactly is with the organization currently.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and a.k.a. the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry, and first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. And guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube, where if you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And we're a couple subscribers away from 4,000. I remember a couple of months ago, it was a race with, Locked On Sports Atlanta to get to 5,000, and we still haven't even passed 4,000, guys. Like, hook a brother up. I know, analytics are telling me about 60% of you guys watch the shows that aren't subscribed. So, please hit that subscribe button. And in the notion of where you can find Locked On Falcons, of course, you can find on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV as part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. Just download that Locked On Sports Atlanta app, and you'll get all the Locked On Sports Atlanta shows like Locked On Falcons, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, etc. So make sure you check that out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So, guys, today's episode, we are talking about the year-end presser that we got from Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot on Wednesday, and sort of, we got a little bit of information on sort of how the defensive coordinator search is potentially going to go. Arthur Smith was quoted as saying, we're going to cast a wide net and we're going to take their time. They're going to take their time. And so, the other news that sort of came out on Wednesday was that the Falcons are one of the 2 coaching staffs alongside the New England Patriots that will be headed to Vegas to coach the East or West team in the Shrine Bowl, which will be, Pro Bowl week, the week before the Super Bowl this year. So that's a great opportunity. As we get closer to these all-star games, we'll talk about sort of what that may mean for the team's, off-season moves and draft plans. We know that this regime has gone very heavily on Senior Bowl players the past 2 drafts. And so now we might mix in a little bit more Shrine Bowl guys, given that they'll get some direct access to some of those guys, particularly on day 3 of the draft. So that will be something interesting to sort of unpack. But as far as the defensive coordinator search, I think it's a reasonable expectation that you would imagine that they would want to have that D coordinator in place for that Shrine Bowl week of practice ahead of time. So that probably gives us a rough timeline of saying, they probably like to have that job settled within the next 2 or 3 weeks by the time we get to late January before they go down there in late January, early February. So that's kind of a rough timetable. We'll sort of see what the expectations of that are. The other thing that came out of that presser is, I know a lot of people were questioning, okay, are we going to move away from the 3-4? We're going to go to the 4-3. That stuff can be a little bit overrated because everybody runs hybrid fronts, but we did at least get an update from Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith, basically with the expectation they want to be multiple and hybrid up front. So they will continue down that path, and the new defensive coordinator will, basically have to, mesh with that sort of philosophy in terms of what they want to do defensively. So it won't be some massive overhaul in terms of somebody coming in and completely changing how they, operate, at least up front. Now, maybe it changes in the back end, where I really do think it's less, today's NFL is less about what fronts you run, and it's more about the coverage shells you run. That's what really differentiates defenses. How much zone you run versus how much man, or you cover two, cover three, all that sort of stuff. So that to me is the real schematic differences that a new D coordinator could potentially bring. But that I know there's going to be a lot of speculation over the next couple of days and weeks about potential candidates. I know some of you guys have sort of your ideal options. And I don't necessarily, and I'll reiterate the point I sort of discussed 2 days ago on the podcast. I don't personally have like a horse in the race. I am less focused on who the new defensive coordinator, although as we go along, ultimately when the race is run, right, I will have an opinion on the horse that actually wins the race. So don't worry about that, and we'll break that stuff down. But in terms of like having an expectation, I don't necessarily have that. So we may not necessarily be as hyper focused on the candidates moving forward as maybe some other people will be, and a lot of that is due to just my belief that scheme, while it matters, is not as important on defense as it is, say, on offense, right? To me, it's more about talent on defense than it is the other way around. And a lot of that is due to my belief that, because offense is always sort of dictating what's happening on a given play, and defenses are already always reacting to that, it's harder to be sort of an ideal scheme. And one analogy that I would use for folks when they think about this in this concept is like, if you're sieging a castle, right? The offense is the people trying to break into the castle, and the defense are the people that trying to repel them from getting out of the castle. And so, where the offense attacks, right, the front gate, the back gate, the defense has to adjust, right? If the offense tries to put ladders or siege towers up, they have to adjust. If they're sapping, by digging underneath the walls, they have to adjust. If they're catapulting, rocks and stones and fireballs, into the walls or over the walls, the defense has to figure it out. And so defense has to basically have an answer for all things. And ultimately, to use this analogy, ultimately, whether you repel that invading army is, at the end of the day, it's going to rely on the people on the wall or, behind the walls, just fighting those people off and going out there and executing. And the same thing applies with offense and defense, whether the offense is, run heavy team, a pass heavy team, has big receivers, fast receivers, pass catching tight ends, pass catching running backs. Defenses have to have answers for it all. And so that takes talent, that takes players and playmakers that can do all the things that you need it to do, facing various different types of offenses throughout the season. And that takes, talent. And so I think the thing I'll continue to reiterate, to me, it's less about, who's calling the plays and more about who are the players out there on the field executing the calls is sort of where I tend to focus on. But we will, leave that conversation aside, and we'll move on to talk a little bit about, this new phase of the offseason, the new phase of this team's building that Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith acknowledged in their presser. And that will lead us into a conversation a little bit more about Rich McKay, and whether or not there's like pressure from above, from ownership, from the front office where Rich McKay currently resides, for this team to win right now. And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode, guys. But first, I want to tell you about BetOnline, the number one source for your sports betting info, stats, news, analysis. And of course, since I know you guys love podcasts, you can find those at betonline.net, and you can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from football to basketball to soccer, esports, tennis, golf, hockey, everything. They got you covered at betonline.net. And I know if you're looking for this weekend's lines for NFL playoffs, BetOnline has you covered as well. I know I certainly will be heading over to BetOnline and using my mobile device to learn more, and you can too. BetOnline, where the game starts. And I also want to tell you about today's other sponsor, the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your own franchise, your dream has come true. This is the game for you. You can manage every strategic aspect of your team: hiring, firing coaches, coordinators, trading, signing, drafting players. The challenges are real. It's realistic. It's great, guys. And if you want to download the game, just go to ultimate-gm.com. Look it up in the App Store. That's ultimate-gm.com. And the great thing, guys, is you are going to get a 100% free boost to your franchise by using the promo code locked on in all caps, LOCKEDON, in the game shop. Again, that's promo code locked on at ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate GM, start your dynasty today. And guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, you should subscribe to it on YouTube, help us get to 4,000. But, while you're listening and checking us out and looking for a second listen after Locked On Falcons, why not check out Locked On NFL, where you can get the daily conversations about the biggest stories in the NFL. I'm sure they're breaking down the new Pro Bowl games. Right. We'll see what Chris Lindstrom's doing at the Pro Bowl with the various games, playing some dodgeball, all that stuff and more. A lot of news going on in the NFL this week with coaching changes, playoff football, all that and more. So make sure you check out Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So, next part of the conversation I want to talk a little bit about is something I've had several conversations with various fans over the last several weeks and months, where I think there's this impression from a lot of folks, and I would call it a misconception from a lot of folks, that, there's going to be a lot of pressure on this regime to win this year. And I thought Rich McKay sort of poured cold water on that with some of the quotes he had earlier this week. We'll circle back to those. And it's not to sit here and say that winning doesn't matter. Winning certainly matters. And there's always pressure in the NFL to win. And, we know that because the NFL stands for not for long. But I don't think that means that this is some sort of make-break year for this Smith-Fontenot regime, that it's a situation where they have to make the playoffs or else they're going to be fired, as I think a lot of people believe. I know there's a history of, this Falcon team owned by Arthur Blank, not holding on to – no one's had a playoff drought for as long as these guys potentially could have if they don't make the playoffs, a third year in a row, and been able to keep their job. But, I don't know, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, if, Arthur Blank's sort of calling the shots anymore, but we'll discuss that a little bit. And I think what's interesting is, I think the Falcons understand, and Rich McKay sort of was discussing this earlier this week, that they understand that they're rebuilding, and, the old cliches exist, but like Rome wasn't built in a day. They're at the beginning of this rebuild. And I think they're going to be given some patience and leeway to get this thing rolling. And it's really less about, how many games they win. It's about the progress they show. And I think, that's, for me, I think looking back at where we were, like, say 6 months ago, that's a very different place than where I personally was when looking at this regime, because I was talking then about there's pressure to win now and they need to start to get results. And I think we did get to see results, even if the win totals don't necessarily reflect that. And I've expressed this before, but like, you look at the 7-10 finishes from the last 2 years, and to me, they're not the same. And I think people tend to focus a little bit too much on the win losses to sort of be this meaningful thing, a meaningful statement. And it's not necessarily true. You can look at, last year's team and this year's team, and to me, they feel like very different 7-10 teams. You can look at I think it was 6 teams that finished 7-10 this year in the season: the Falcons, the Saints, the Panthers, the Jets, the Browns, and the Titans. And I wouldn't look at all of those teams as the same based off of their record. So I think, you have to think, you have to go a little bit deeper than that. And as a way of sort of explaining it, like, you just look at last year's team. I've infamous, I guess you could say, in some people, of not believing that the 2021 team was a well-coached football team. And I don't think that was the case in 2022, even if the record seemed to be the same. And like, you look at this year compared to last year, and it just seems so different to me, that you look at sort of how this coaching staff, to me, did a pretty good job. By no means perfect, but a pretty good job trying to showcase this team's strengths and mask their weaknesses. And that was reflected in how much they focused on running the football, which was obviously, a top 5 unit in the strength of this football team, and tried to limit how much the passing game was involved in the offense because of how many limitations it had. You saw this reflected in the offensive line. And you saw this reflected in the team trying to evolve beyond just being this one-dimensional run-heavy team. And, depending on who you ask and what you look at, you can say that they did make some steps towards, being a little bit more of a balanced offense by the end of the season than they were at the beginning of the year. You can look at the growth and development of the offensive line. Like, early in the season, it was all play action. We do not want to it's all max protect. We're not going to ask our offensive line for maybe more than a handful of snaps to have to hold up in pass protection. And by the end of the season, they're running relatively speaking, a regular offense when it comes to their protections because the offensive line grew, right? One of the other things that Arthur Smith talked about in his presser, and when he was asked about Tyler Algier and how strong a finish he had to his season, and Arthur Smith brought up several other rookie players that got better as the year went on, including Algier, Drake London, Timmy Horn, another player that we talked about on this podcast, who I was very critical of in September because I'm like, he's just out here wasting space. And by the end of the year, not saying that Timmy Horn is next Aaron Donald or anything like that, but was being a solid contributor to this defense in the stretch. And of course, Desmond Ridder being another prominent example of that. One of the things that Dean Pease talked about in his final press conference announcing his retirement was how much the defense improved in the second half of the season. And Dean Pease talked about changing the culture, and he talked about we successfully were able to build a top 10 defense. And this I don't 100% agree with Dean Pease, but I understand where he's coming from, because we know Dean Pease only cares about how many points you're giving up. And if you look at the last 9 games of the season, last 10 weeks, after week 8, the Falcons from week 9 onward were 10th in the NFL in points allowed per game. So, from Dean Pease's perspective, whether you agree with him or not, they were a top 10 defense, which we wouldn't have said in the first half of the season. Now, I think there's other factors and variables and categories that I tend to look at rather than just points allowed when measuring defense. And that may be something that we'll take a deeper look in the coming days and weeks to really sort of explore where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses of this unit. But it is one of those things where I don't think there's any denying that you can't deny that the defense did look better in the second half of the season than it did in the first half. And that, again, to me, is reflective of coaching and improvement and progress. And that, I think that's really the key of what we're talking about. And so I think that's really what Rich McKay was discussing over the weekend, where we have a couple of quotes from him. And I have a graphic for you guys. And again, reason number 452, why you should subscribe to us on YouTube so you can see these graphics. So I'll put up a graphic of some of the quotes, and I just copied and pasted them from articles written by Josh Kendall of The Athletic and Mike Rothstein of ESPN. And so, they may not be necessarily in order or whatever the case may be. And we'll read a couple of those that I think are key and pivotal, talking about, how this is not necessarily a pressure-packed sort of season. And so we'll get to that right now. And so looking at some of those quotes, right, some of the key ones I thought were interesting is, Rich McKay saying, I'm in the same place I was when we hired them. I'm very confident in where they are, referring to Fontenot and Smith, and what is in front of them. And I think the same would go for Arthur Blank. We all want to win games. Fan bases, God love them, are in it to win games. So we owe that to them, and we will continue down that path. You can have your expectations for next year, and you can have your idea of that. We're in a better place now. We've got more cap room, all of those things. It doesn't mean that all those variables are going to line up that way. That's my one thing I always say as a caveat. When somebody says that they have to go to the playoffs or you got to win this many games, I think all of that is not appropriate. I love it in the media. Internally, that's just not the way we look at it. Internally, it's, are we going in the right direction? Are we following the plan? And are we making progress dealing with the variables also? So, earlier, some of the quotes is like, we all knew the challenges that we face in the roster, sort of acknowledging, the rebuild. He said we would look at it much more as a transition than the word rebuild. And I think that's what you've seen them try to do. So, I think Rich McKay is acknowledging all the same things that I'm saying. And I know there's going to be some pushback from folks that say, what do you expect him to say? Right. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. And I would push back against that pushback. The backlash of the backlash is saying that in the past with Arthur Blank, he's never minced words when it's come to previous coaches like Mike Smith and Dan Quinn, when there has been pressure on them to win. I'm sorry, let me take the graphic down. Sorry, guys. When there has been pressure on those guys to win. And so, like, if that was the same sort of pressure on Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot, I don't think they would be dancing around that, because they've never danced around that in the past. And I don't think that's suddenly going to change. Now, we'll have to sort of see what type of, what's realistic progress for this football team. I will sit here and say that given the current state of the NFC South, given, potential expectations that Tampa Bay, maybe losing their Hall of Fame quarterback. We don't know what the situation with Carolina is, with the coaching staff, what their quarterback situation is. We don't know if the Saints are going to start tearing it down to rebuild themselves or transition, as Rich McKay may say, or they're just going to do the thing that they've been doing consistently for the last decade, which is just basically run it back and try to win now as opposed. And so depending on all those things that happen over the next couple of months, 6 months from now, we'll have a better idea of sort of what are realistic expectations for the season. What is progress going to be measured? And that may be, winning 8 or more games. That may be making the playoffs, all that and more. So I do sit here and think it is feasible for the Falcons to expect this team to make a postseason run next season, even if there are a lot of question marks surrounding this football team, such as at the quarterback position and elsewhere with the defense and all those various things. And, I do expect there should be the expectation that progress should be made towards making the postseason and the desire to make the postseason. But I don't necessarily think that means, hey, if they don't make the postseason, they're out of jobs. Now, we'll see how that goes. Again, this is going to be an ongoing discussion here on this podcast all offseason long. But it does feel like to me that anybody who's approaching this offseason as, they're going to have to make these big moves, that like they're not going to be able to be, committed to Desmond Ridder. And they have to make a big, bold move at the quarterback position because there's pressure for them to win now. I think that may be a little bit off the base. Now, they may decide to go and make a big splash at the quarterback position. I'll never put anything past this regime after last year and some of the choices that were made, that were all some of the curveballs that they've thrown us over the years. So everything is on the table. But, I don't necessarily think there is going to be that expectation, that pressure from above is more the point that they have to win now. They have to go out there and make that big move. They have to make the playoffs because their jobs, are on the line. So I don't think that's the case. But speaking of pressure from above, let's talk a little bit more about Rich McKay and sort of what exactly is his role now with the Falcons kind of reshuffling thing. And that's why he spoke to the media to sort of talk a little bit about, some changes in terms of the upper echelons of this organization, with certain people having different and new responsibilities. And we'll get into sort of what exactly Rich McKay's responsibilities are for this football team moving forward. And we'll continue that on today's Locked On Falcons. But first, I want to tell you about our proud sponsor, Built Bar. Everybody wants to eat a little bit healthier this time of year. And if you're like me and you don't want to sacrifice or compromise on taste, Built Bar is the thing for you. It's the healthy protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. And the thing that makes Built Bar so good is they're covered in 100% real chocolate. And you can check out a variety of flavors like peanut butter brownie and coconut almond. And, the great thing about Built Bars is you're only getting 130 calories. You're getting 4 grams of sugar, but you're getting a whopping 17 grams of protein with that great flavor. And of course, for years, we've been telling you, go on over to built.com and order yourself your own box. And you can still go there, check out the new flavors, check out the sales. But most importantly, guys, you can now go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club to get your Built Bars. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart, head to the pharmacy section, grab yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. If you're at Sam's, run in, grab yourself a 13-bar box of brownie batter or churro. You can thank me later. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, we have a listener question from a week ago from someone in the Discord. Link in the description below if you want to join the Discord and, ask your questions and get, more direct feedback without having to wait, a week or a couple of days on the podcast to get my responses from certain things. But this comes from 47KJ21 in the Discord, aka TJ. He asks, I want to applaud you for talking Falcon Football Daily. Thank you. You're welcome. TJ, my question would be, realistically, how much impact do you think Rich McKay has had in the last several years, including this regime, if any at all? I'm curious, and what new things can we see for the podcast coming this offseason? Thank you for the daily listen. Great insight as always. I have learned a lot since listening to all your shows since early 2015. TJ. Thank you, TJ. To answer your question about Rich McKay, I don't really know. And my general philosophy is, if I don't know a thing, I try not to make assumptions about a thing. So I'm not going to make too many assumptions, or I'll try to minimize the amount of assumptions when guessing Rich McKay's role. Now, what's interesting about my feelings towards Rich McKay is, at least I perceive my feelings to be fairly neutral towards Rich McKay, but because the vast majority of Falcon fans that I've come across and certain media members, have a very negative opinion towards Rich McKay. By contrast, my opinion towards him seems very positive when I just think it's kind of neutral. So, if this comes off as me being positive towards Rich McKay, again, I don't think it is. I just think it's me being neutral. I just don't have this very anti-negative slant towards Rich McKay. But I think the root of that negativity towards Rich McKay, the Falcons CEO, and we should reiterate, it seems like the Falcons kind of reshuffled their the business side of things. And announced that Greg Beatles is kind of taking over the business side of things for the Falcons and some of the other blank-owned entities like the Atlanta United. And Rich McKay kind of is going to focus solely on football. He's like officially the Falcons CEO, and he's solely a football person. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. But when it comes to Rich McKay, I think a lot of people's negativity towards him is because of the Bobby Petrino fiasco, right? The earlier fiasco from 15 years ago, as opposed to the one from, 9 months ago. I understand why people have negativity towards him for that hire and that embarrassment and whatever. But I tend to try to focus more on looking at things that happen based off of the process rather than the results, right? And I feel like the process back then that led to that very bad result with Bobby Petrino was somewhat mitigated by so much of what they were doing then was designed as an organization to either quote unquote fix or maximize Michael Vick, right? They kind of hit a wall with Michael Vick and were trying to get over that hump with him and turn him into he was a superstar, but turn him into a consistently good quarterback. And they brought in Bobby Petrino believing that his sort of spread scheme from college would be the thing that would truly unlock Vick. And I understood why they thought that, because you can kind of, use hindsight and look, ahead a decade to see what Bobby Petrino was able to do with Lamar Jackson at Louisville and sort of understand that, at least, theoretically, it obviously did not work out here in Atlanta, but theoretically, I think they were on the right path. Now, it's not to sit here and say that, hiring Bobby Petrino was a good decision or whatever. But, obviously it had a terrible result. So I'm not sort of relitigating that. But like, I also look at it and I'm like, yeah, that result was so unprecedented, so unpredictable. Like it's never really happened before that. It's not really happened since then, where you had a coach just basically walk out on the job, midway through the season. And so, I understand that led to a lot of embarrassment. I know for me at the time, it was very embarrassing at the time. And I think part of the negativity towards Rich McKay is like, someone has to suffer for it. Bobby Petrino was able to get off scot-free. Someone's head has to roll. And I think a lot of people are looking at Rich McKay. Meanwhile, Rich McKay, while he was demoted, he was punished, he was all that sort of stuff, he still maintained, a job with the Falcons. And it was, he's stripped of like football decision-making stuff, right? And that's when Thomas Dimitroff and Mike Smith and all those guys came in to make those football decisions. And Rich McKay was shuffled to the business side of things, right? And he was instrumental in sort of getting Mercedes-Benz Stadium built and all that stuff. And that's basically what he worked towards for the next decade after that Petrino fiasco. And I'm sure some of you guys are like, well, now I hate Mercedes-Benz Stadium because Rich McKay had something to do with it. It's a gaudy eyesore or something like that, just because of your enmity towards Rich McKay and all the things that he touches with the Falcons will lead you guys to have a negative opinion of those things. But, since that stadium got built a couple of years ago, he's tried to make a move back to the football side of things. And that was something that we discussed, I believe, with Jeff Schultz of The Athletic, 2-3 years ago after the firing of Thomas Dimitroff and Dan Quinn, and wondering sort of what Rich McKay's presence would it impact their ability to lure, top candidates at the GM job, at the head coaching job, because those people would presumably report to Rich McKay. And, I'm sure some of you think it did, because you're not necessarily huge fans of Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot, and maybe others of you would disagree with that. So I will let you guys decide on whether or not that was the case. But it does seem like now, Rich McKay is fully engaged in the football side of things. And I think his current role with the team is basically to be, the stand-in for Arthur Blank on the football side of things. That it does feel to me that Arthur Blank has taken major steps back away from running the day-to-day things about, the teams and the organizations that he's part of, and letting the Greg Beatles and the Steve Cannons and now the Rich McKays sort of do that stuff on a day-to-day basis, due to Arthur Blank's, age and health, issues that he's dealt with the last couple of years. And, that's part of the reason why, seemingly the whole Watson situation last year was so out of nowhere because it felt like, and again, not to absolve Smith, Fontenot, or even McKay from, having some responsibility, sharing some of the responsibility for that. It did feel like, that came out of nowhere. The various reports saying that, Deshaun Watson texted Arthur Blank and was like, "Come get me," and then Arthur Blank was like, "Okay," and then stormed into everybody's office like, "We're going to get this guy." That's an oversimplification of that, and we'll probably never know the full truth of that situation because, for obvious reasons, I don't think everybody's going to sort of divulge those secrets at any point in the future, but maybe one day. But I think that's kind of what Rich McKay's role is, and he's basically the person that Smith and Fontenot, that is, now report to, seemingly, and he's basically the person that whispers in Arthur Blank's ear, being like, "Hey, thumbs up, they're doing a great job," as his earlier quotes seem to indicate. We like the progress that they're showing, or thumbs down at a point where we're not seeing that progress. It's going to be Rich McKay telling Arthur Blank that. So basically, he's the little devil or angel. I'm sure some of you guys think devil on Arthur Blank's shoulders, telling him, sort of, feeding him that information from the football side of things to basically say, we're moving in the right direction, but, Arthur, you can chill, right? We'll run this, you set back, count your money. I don't know what rich people, do on a yacht or whatever, what I'm saying. So whatever Arthur Blank does on a day-to-day basis, uh, take money baths or something like that, whatever that is. So I think that's kind of Rich McKay's role. So again, I'm neutral to it. In terms of specific things that he's done, I don't know. So you guys give me your feedback on Rich McKay. I already know what that feedback is going to be, but I'm talking about like specifics. If your beef with Rich McKay is, is there any other beef with Rich McKay? I'm curious if other people have beefs with Rich McKay other than the Bobby Petrino thing. Is it just that, or are you still holding on to the Jim Moore situation not working out? I don't know. You tell me. I'm very curious if it's more than just the Petrino stuff. Yeah, because it seems like it's just that. But to answer your other question about offseason plans, the pod is going to be basically as it has always been consistently in the offseason. January is going to be a lot of positional breakdown, self-evaluation, reflecting on the most recent season. And then as we get to February, we'll start to transition to looking towards the offseason and talk draft, combine, free agency. And of course, that will be the bulk of free agency, that is in March, and in the draft in April, and that sort of thing. The one new wrinkle, I guess you could say, this offseason will be, I will be attending the Senior Bowl for the first time. There was a part of me that was like, I should go to the Shrine Bowl just to be different. But, I was like, let me go to the Senior Bowl first and maybe Shrine Bowl in the future. And so, or we'll have to miss my opportunity to watch Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot coach these players, during the practice week. But I'll be going to the Senior Bowl for the first time this year. Jarvis will also be there. So we'll probably have some, content for you guys during that week at the end of January, early February, related to that stuff. So that will probably be a different wrinkle. Exactly what that will be, Jarvis and I will basically figure it out when we get there. But that's going to be probably the biggest change to what our usual offseason plan is going to be. So, obviously you guys have an opportunity to influence what we can do this offseason because, we're a lot more freewheeling during the offseason than we are during the regular season, where it's like, talk about the most recent game, talk about the upcoming game, and sort of that cycle just constantly repeating itself, for 18 weeks. And that's where, Q&As and mailbags, and you guys can ask questions and make suggestions for topics that you want covered on the show. And of course, you can make those suggestions by leaving a comment here on YouTube. Of course, hit me up in the Discord, link in the description below. You can also send an email to lockdownfalcons@mail.com. And of course, hit me up on social media, on Twitter, Facebook at Locked On Falcons. So that is it, guys. We'll be back tomorrow to discuss the new CFL cornerback and maybe catch up on some other news that we might have under discussed this past week. So we'll have a guest talking about Jamal Peters and his time with the Toronto Argonauts, I believe, on tomorrow's episode. And maybe we'll get to some other topics But this is what the off season is. I don't. There's no plan, right? Like it's just like we'll figure it out. So that's basically 6 months of that is basically my off season plan. It's like yeah, sure. Tomorrow we'll talk about something. So that's what's on deck. Make sure you make Locked On Falcons your first listen so that you can find out that great mystery of what we're going to discuss in addition to Jamal Peters on tomorrow's episode. And of course, make sure you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, ATL Day Ones, and Locked On NFL for your second listen. Of course, subscribe to them on all the same podcast platforms that you watch or listen to Locked On Falcons. And again, guys, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already here on Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Would really appreciate getting over 4,000. By the time we get to the Senior Bowl at this rate, can we get that? Hook a brother up. That's all I got to say, All right. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.